I'm a 29-year-old software engineer, and for as long as I can remember, my parents made sure I understood one thing. Everything they did for me was a sacrifice. They reminded me constantly that raising me wasn't just a duty, it was an investment. My childhood was full of comments about how much they struggled to give me opportunities, and how, one day, when I was successful, I would pay them back for everything they had done. I grew up under strict rules, always reminded that my future wasn't just mine, it was a shared project. If I got a good job, it wasn't just my success, it was theirs, too. My parents framed it as love and family values, but even as a kid, it felt more like a debt hanging over me. The message was clear: my achievements would be their reward. Determined not to be trapped by guilt, I worked hard in school, landed a full scholarship, and moved out at 18. That was my first real taste of freedom. I made sure I never had to rely on them financially. Every bill I paid on my own, every step I took toward independence, felt like breaking a chain. But just because I was free didn't mean they saw it that way. Meanwhile, my younger brother, who's 24 now, lived a completely different life. He was never pushed the way I was. No lectures about sacrifice, no expectations of paying anything back. While I had to earn every bit of independence, he was allowed to stay home rent-free, with our parents covering his expenses. If he struggled with money, they helped him. If I ever asked for help, not that I did, they reminded me of how much they had already done for me. At first, the financial demands were subtle. When I got my first real paycheck, my parents joked about how it was their turn to be taken care of. I brushed it off. When I got a promotion, they started making small requests. Help with a bill here, covering a repair there. Nothing major, but the tone was different. It wasn't a request, it was an expectation. Then the demands grew. They wanted me to pay off their mortgage, buy them a new car, cover family vacations. They didn't ask my brother for anything. It was all on me. For a while, I helped with little things. A bill here, a gift there, because they were my parents, and I thought that was just being a good son. But then the numbers got bigger. When I refused to pay off their house, my mother started getting emotional, talking about how much they struggled to give me a future. My father wasn't as subtle. He outright said I owed them, that it was my responsibility. I finally put my foot down and told them I wasn't going to be their retirement plan. That's when things escalated. My mother called a family meeting, but it wasn't a discussion, it was an ambush. My parents, my brother, and even some extended family were there. They painted me as the ungrateful son who turned his back on his family. My father went as far as saying that if I truly loved them, I would contribute financially. They compared me to cousins who took care of their parents, saying I was selfish for not doing the same. My aunts and uncles chimed in, reinforcing the guilt. Even my brother, who had always benefited from their favoritism, called me selfish. Then came the emotional manipulation. My mother cried, saying they had given up their dreams for me, that I was their pride, their hope, and now I was abandoning them. I stood my ground. I told them I appreciated everything they did, but I wasn't going to bankroll their lifestyle. They had years to plan for their retirement. I wasn't their safety net. That was the final straw. My parents accused me of betrayal. My father said if I walked out that door without agreeing to help them, I was no longer part of the family. After walking out of that so-called family meeting, I expected anger, but I didn't expect the silence. My parents, who used to bombard me with messages about money, suddenly stopped responding. No calls, no texts, nothing. It wasn't peace, it was punishment. At first I ignored it. Then my younger brother stepped in. He sent me a long message, one of those guilt-ridden monologues that wasn't asking for a response, just meant to make me feel like the villain. He talked about how I was turning my back on the people who gave me everything, how our parents were heartbroken, how I was destroying the family, and of course how he had to deal with their disappointment now. I didn't reply. I knew where this was going. 2 weeks later, my mother finally broke the silence. The message was short, just a reminder that a good son wouldn't let his parents suffer. No mention of the last conversation, no acknowledgement of their threats to cut me off, just an expectation that I would step back in line. That's when the extended family got involved. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who hadn't spoken to me in months, even years, suddenly cared. One after another, messages poured in. They weren't aggressive, but they all had the same theme. Family is everything. Parents make sacrifices. One day I'd regret this. Some were more direct, saying I was being selfish. Others just hoped I would come to my senses. Then came the real manipulation. My parents claimed they needed money for medical bills. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. This is serious kind of message. No room for refusal. But something felt off. I offered to pay the bills directly instead of sending money. That's when the excuses started. They didn't have the documents on hand. The hospital only took cash. They needed it immediately. No time for verification. That didn't sit right with me, so I made a few calls. Their doctor's office had no record of any major health issues. There were no emergencies, no unpaid medical expenses. They lied. I sent one last message, laying out my terms. No more financial demands. If there was ever a real emergency, I'd help, but only after verifying it myself. Other than that, I was done. That didn't go over well. My younger brother took screenshots of our conversation and sent them to the family group chat, spinning it in a way that made me look heartless. Suddenly, the guilt tripping turned into full-blown outrage. A flood of messages, accusations, insults. Some relatives played the disappointed card, saying they never expected this from me. Others went straight to name-calling. Then somehow, it followed me to work. A family friend who worked in the same industry pulled me aside. Apparently, my parents had spread their sob story far and wide, even trying to manipulate professional contacts into pressuring me. Luckily, my workplace had already heard my side, so their attempts didn't gain any traction. That's when I realized how far my parents had spread this story. It wasn't just within the family anymore. They were trying to turn the world against me. Not everyone bought into it, though. Out of nowhere, a cousin reached out. We weren't particularly close, but they had their own experience with parents who saw children as financial plans. They told me cutting off financially demanding family members was the best thing they ever did. That was the first real support I had, but my parents weren't done. My mother took it to social media. A vague post, but obvious enough, something about raising children who turn their backs when they're needed most. The comments were filled with sympathy from her friends and distant relatives, people who only heard her side. I wasn't tagged, but the message was clear. Then my younger brother sent another message, this time with a deal. If I sent him money, he would talk to our parents and smooth things over. That told me everything I needed to know. He didn't care about family loyalty. He was just trying to get something out of it. I ignored it. Hours later, my father sent the final message. No more guilt trips. No more begging. Just one sentence. If I wasn't willing to contribute to the family, I was no longer part of it. I expected to feel something. Regret, anger, anything. But instead, all I felt was relief. A month passed without any contact from my parents or younger brother. After my father's last message declaring me no longer part of the family, I assumed they had finally given up. Then, out of nowhere, my mother reached out again. This time, there was no guilt trip. No accusations, just a friendly message, acting as if nothing had happened. She asked how I was doing, mentioned some distant relatives, and even threw in a casual joke. It was so out of character that I immediately knew something was off. I waited. I knew if I ignored the message long enough, the real reason for her sudden kindness would show itself. It didn't take long. A few days later, she sent another message, slipping in a mention of the house needing renovations. It wasn't a direct request, but the way she phrased it made it clear she was expecting me to step in. That was enough to confirm my suspicions. But then I got a message from a relative who wasn't usually involved in the family drama. They asked if it was true that I had promised to cover my parents' home renovations. Apparently, my parents had already been telling people that I was paying for everything. Contractors had even been contacted. Estimates gathered. They were so confident, I would agree that they had started planning before even asking me. When I confronted them, my father immediately backtracked. He called it a misunderstanding, saying they thought I would want to help. But if I wasn't able to, they would figure something out. It was the same pattern as before. Manipulation disguised as a conversation. Before I even had time to process that mess, my younger brother jumped in with a new demand. Since I wasn't paying for our parents, he decided I should at least help him with a down payment for a house. He framed it as a fair compromise, since he was the one staying close to our parents, while I had abandoned them. He insisted that I had the money, and that helping him was the least I could do. I shut that down immediately. There was no argument, no discussion. I just said no. That set off another explosion. My brother went off about how I was selfish, how I only cared about myself, how he had always known I would turn my back on family. It was the same script my parents had used, just coming from him this time. Then my parents escalated things even further. They threatened to spread lies about me at my workplace. They claimed they had connections and could damage my reputation if I continued to humiliate them by refusing to support them. It was an empty threat. I knew they didn't have any real influence in my industry, but the fact that they were even willing to go that far was enough. That was the final line for me. I blocked them. My parents, my younger brother, gone. But they found ways around it. New numbers, fake social media accounts, and even getting relatives to pass their messages along. No more direct contact, but their attempts at manipulation continued. That didn't stop some relatives from trying to pull me back in. A few reached out, saying I had taken things too far. They didn't agree with my parents' demands, but blocking them completely, that apparently was cruel. They suggested I should at least apologize and keep some contact for the sake of keeping the family together. I ignored every one of those messages. Then a distant cousin who had been staying out of all this reached out with something I wasn't expecting. He told me my parents had been taking out loans for years, loans they fully expected me to pay off. It wasn't just about their mortgage or their medical lies. They had been borrowing money under the assumption that once I was successful, I would handle it. The moment I heard that, I checked my credit. No fraudulent activity, no suspicious accounts in my name, but I didn't take any chances. I locked everything down, set up fraud alerts, and made sure they had no way of using my name for anything. Then came the last message, a final attempt to hurt me. My parents somehow got through with a different number, sending one last message calling me a disgrace. They claimed they would legally disown me, making sure I was never recognized as their son again. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. They had made it clear what I was to them, a financial plan that failed. And now, for the first time in my life, I was truly free. A knock at my door caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting anyone, and after everything that had happened, I wasn't in the mood for surprises. When I opened it, my younger brother was standing there. He wasn't angry or yelling like before. This time he looked composed, almost rehearsed. It was clear, he wasn't here on his own. He had been sent. I stepped aside, letting him in. He didn't waste time getting to the point. Our father, according to him, had been losing sleep over my betrayal. The stress was getting to him, and the family was falling apart. Then came the real purpose of his visit. He suggested a compromise. If I wasn't willing to pay for everything, I could at least send a monthly allowance to our parents. It didn't need to be much, just enough to show I still cared. I didn't entertain the idea. I told him plainly that I wasn't giving them a single dollar. That should have been the end of it. But my brother wasn't done. He hesitated, then let something slip. Our parents weren't just struggling because I refused to fund them. They were in trouble because they had taken out a massive loan, one they assumed I would pay off. That got my attention. I started asking questions, and the more I pushed, the more cracks appeared in his story. Eventually it all came out. They had refinanced their house, pulling out a huge sum of money. The plan was simple: use the money now, and once I inevitably stepped up, I would take over the payments. Except I never stepped up. I needed to see for myself. As soon as my brother left, I checked my financial records. That's when I found something worse. My father had attempted to forge my name as a cosigner. Fortunately, banks require direct confirmation, and his attempt was flagged before it could go through. He had tried to tie me to their debt legally, probably assuming that once my name was on it, I would have no choice but to pay. That was it. I called the bank immediately, making sure my name wasn't attached to anything. Luckily, they had flagged the request since I hadn't signed anything. But that close call was enough to make one thing clear. This wasn't just about financial pressure anymore. This was fraud. I sent a final message to my father. No emotion, no explanations, just a warning. If he ever tried anything like that again, I would take legal action. I wouldn't hesitate. His response came fast. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an attempt to fix things. It was pure rage. He called me ungrateful, selfish, a disgrace to the family. Then finally, the words I knew were coming. I was dead to them. My younger brother sent one last message, still trying to reason with me. He said I was destroying the family, that cutting off our parents would break everything apart. I didn't argue. I didn't explain myself. I was done. I blocked my parents. I blocked my younger brother. No more messages. No more guilt trips. No more manipulation. For the first time, the line was drawn, and there was no going back. A cousin reached out unexpectedly, warning me about what was happening online. My mother had taken her complaints to social media, posting vague but pointed messages about an ungrateful son who abandoned his parents after they sacrificed everything for him. The comments were filled with sympathy, with family members and family friends chiming in about how heartbreaking it was to see a child turn on his own parents. Nowhere in her posts did she mention the financial demands, the manipulation, or the attempted fraud. The story she told made it seem like I had walked away for no reason, leaving my parents struggling while I lived comfortably. She framed it as if I had used them to get ahead, and then discarded them the moment I no longer needed them. The impact wasn't just online. A former family friend, someone in my industry, approached me at work. They weren't aggressive, but their message was clear. They had heard my parents' side and were disappointed in me. That was when I realized just how far my parents had spread their version of events. I responded to my relatives once. I made it clear that they did not know the full story, and that my decision was final. I wasn't going to justify myself repeatedly. Any further harassment would result in them being cut off as well. My younger brother, unsurprisingly, doubled down. He sent a long message, blaming me for tearing the family apart. According to him, I had turned my back on my responsibilities, and he was now stuck dealing with the fallout. There was no acknowledgement of everything our parents had done, just another attempt to make me feel guilty. Then another cousin reached out with something new. My parents were now telling people that I owed them for my college tuition. They claimed they had paid for my education, and that I had promised to pay them back once I had a stable job. That was a complete lie. I had earned a full scholarship and never received a cent from them for school. But the fact that they were willing to rewrite history just to justify their demands showed how desperate they had become. I wasn't taking any chances. I consulted a lawyer to ensure they couldn't use my name for financial gain. Even though they hadn't been able to list me as a co-signer on their loans, I wanted to make sure they couldn't pull anything else. The lawyer advised me to send a formal warning, making it clear that any further attempts at fraud would result in immediate legal action. That notice was sent. Then came my mother's final attempt. A long emotional message, saying she would never forgive me, that this was my last chance to make things right before I lost my family forever. I didn't respond. I had already lost my family the moment they decided I was nothing more than a bank account. I blocked every extended family member still harassing me. The door was officially closed. Weeks passed in complete silence. No messages, no phone calls, no sudden visits. Nothing. After all the chaos, the quiet felt almost strange. Without the constant pressure of guilt, manipulation, and financial demands, life became normal. Work was steady. Friends filled my free time, and for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis to drop. Then, out of nowhere, my mother sent an email. The subject line was simple: "We never wanted things to end this way." The message was long, emotional, carefully crafted. She talked about love, about family, about how they had only wanted the best for me. There was no mention of money, no accusations, just a plea for reconciliation. If I hadn't already been through this cycle multiple times, it might have sounded genuine. But the timing was suspicious. A few days later, a family friend reached out with a warning. My parents were trying to secure another loan, and there was talk that they might attempt once again to involve me in it. That explained the email. It was never about fixing the relationship. It was about softening me up before another financial request. I didn't take any chances. I checked my financial records again, made sure everything was locked down, and placed additional fraud alerts just in case. I wasn't going to be caught off guard. Then, another message from my mother came through, this time full of urgency. My father's health, according to her, was declining because of the stress I had caused. She described him as weak, losing sleep, struggling to get through the day. It was the same tactic as before, but more desperate this time. Instead of responding, I reached out to a relative who still spoke to them. My father was perfectly fine. He wasn't sick. He wasn't struggling. He was just furious that his financial safety net had disappeared. Then came the real desperation. My parents claimed they were consulting a lawyer to see if they could legally force me to pay their debts. It was an empty threat, but I checked with my own lawyer just in case. As expected, they had no legal standing. I had never signed anything, never agreed to anything, and legally, I owed them nothing. My younger brother made one last attempt, a single voice message, full of rage. He accused me of being the worst son in existence, of destroying the family, of leaving them all to suffer while I lived selfishly. It was full of resentment, but also frustration. He had run out of ways to manipulate me. Then, the final play, my mother contacted my workplace, hoping to damage my reputation. She told them I had abandoned my family, that I was a disgrace, that I wasn't the man they thought I was. But my manager was already aware of the situation. The attempt failed. If anything, it only proved how far they were willing to go. That was the last straw. I sent one final legal notice, making it clear that any further attempts to interfere in my life, whether through fraud, harassment, or workplace sabotage, would result in legal consequences. With that, the chapter was officially closed. Weeks passed with complete silence. No more messages. No sudden appearances. No desperate attempts to guilt-trip me into submission. It felt like they had finally given up. Then, out of nowhere, I received a letter from a lawyer. My parents had escalated things to a whole new level. The letter was a legal demand for financial compensation for the cost of raising me. They had itemized every possible expense: food, housing, medical care, even gas money for driving me to school. It was absurd. They were essentially trying to bill me for my entire childhood, as if I had signed a contract agreeing to pay them back for existing. I immediately forwarded everything to my lawyer, who dismissed the claims as ridiculous, but advised me to document everything carefully. Even though the lawsuit had no legal ground, the fact that they were willing to take this route meant they weren't done trying to shake me down for money. Word spread quickly. Some relatives, the same ones who had either stayed out of things or mildly encouraged me to fix things, were now shocked. A few reached out, saying they had no idea my parents would go this far. Others, however, still tried to spin it, telling me that if I just settled things quietly, I could keep the family together, as if that was even possible at this point. My lawyer dug deeper into their financial situation and confirmed what I already suspected. My parents were drowning in debt. They had maxed out their credit, taken out loans they couldn't afford, and had no retirement savings. This lawsuit wasn't about justice or principle. It was a desperate attempt to pull themselves out of a financial disaster they had created. Then, they escalated things even further. My parents started spreading rumors, this time in my professional circle. They contacted people I had worked with, painting themselves as helpless elderly parents abandoned by their successful son. A few people in my industry reached out, confused by the sudden accusations. Luckily, I had already warned my manager about my family's history of manipulation, so any damage was minimal. My lawyer wasted no time. A cease and desist letter was sent, warning that any further defamation would result in legal action. If they wanted to keep dragging my name through the mud, they would have to face real consequences. Then, out of nowhere, my younger brother resurfaced. After months of defending our parents and calling me selfish, my brother reached out again. He wasn't suddenly on my side. He was just looking out for himself. He wanted to move out, but since our parents couldn't support him anymore, he expected me to take over that role. He framed it as if he was now on my side, as if we could move past everything if I just helped him out this once. I didn't even hesitate. I reminded him that he had made his choice when he sided with them. He had called me selfish, a traitor, and the worst son in existence. he was on his own now. With my lawyer handling the lawsuit, I sent one final warning through legal channels. If they continued to harass me, there would be consequences. My parents had spent their entire lives controlling me with guilt, manipulation, and financial threats. But now, for the first time, they were the ones facing real consequences. The lawsuit didn't even make it past the first stage. The court dismissed it immediately, ruling that my parents had no legal basis for their claim. They had no case, no contract, and no real argument, just an absurd demand for financial compensation for raising their own child. The judge didn't waste time on it. My parents, however, were furious. They claimed the judge was biased, that the legal system was corrupt, that they had been denied justice. It wasn't their fault. It was never their fault. It was always someone else's doing. They had convinced themselves that they were going to win, that the court would somehow force me to pay them for the past 29 years. Then, a relative came forward with another revelation. Before the case was even heard, my parents had been telling people they would win. They had already started planning how they would spend the money. According to them, it was a done deal. They were even talking about what they would do with their monthly payments from me, as if it was guaranteed. The humiliation of losing so easily only made them angrier. That's when my younger brother snapped. He called in a rage, furious at me for letting it come to this. In his mind, I had destroyed the family. I had humiliated our parents, left them with nothing, and refused to fix the situation when I could have. It didn't matter to him that they had brought this on themselves. In his eyes, they were suffering because of me. I told him I was done. Done with him. Done with our parents. Done with the entire toxic cycle. That was all it took to set him off. He exploded, shouting accusations, hurling insults, desperate to get a reaction. When that didn't work, he sent one last message. He promised that one day, when our parents were gone, I would regret everything, that I would look back and realize what I had done. I blocked him. Then came my parents' next desperate move. Despite everything, despite the legal notice warning them against fraud, they still tried to take out a loan in my name. But this time, I had already prepared. Because of the fraud alerts I had placed on my financial accounts, the attempt failed immediately. The bank flagged the attempt, contacted me, and ensured that my name could not be used in any financial transaction connected to them. Not long after, I received an email from my father. It was short, filled with nothing but anger. He officially disowned me. According to him, I was no longer his son. My name was wiped from their family, and they wanted nothing to do with me. Some extended family members followed suit. A few cut ties, fully believing my parents' twisted version of events. Others reached out quietly, saying they didn't agree with my parents, but also didn't want to get involved. I didn't bother convincing anyone. Then came one last attempt at manipulation. A handwritten letter from my mother arrived in the mail. The message was different this time. No accusations, no threats, just a quiet statement that she forgave me. She said she hoped one day I would return, that I would remember that family is forever. I didn't respond. Reality was setting in for my parents. They had burned every bridge. The financial situation they had ignored for so long was crashing down on them. They couldn't keep up their lifestyle, and with no one left to bail them out, they had no choice but to sell the house. But their debt was too high, and the market wasn't in their favor. They struggled to find a buyer who would take it with their financial situation attached to it. My lawyer sent one final cease and desist notice. This was the last warning. Any further attempts to interfere in my life, financially or otherwise, would result in legal action. That was the last I heard from them. Sometime later, I learned from a distant relative that my parents had followed through on their final punishment. They officially removed me from their will, as if it mattered, as if it was some devastating consequence that I would regret for the rest of my life. I never wanted anything from them. I never needed anything from them. And now, for the first time, I was truly free. A full year passed without a single word from my parents or younger brother. After everything that happened, the silence felt like the final confirmation that I had truly broken free. No more sudden guilt trips. No more financial demands. No more schemes. Life moved forward without the weight of family drama hanging over me. I focused on my career, deepened my friendships, and for the first time in my life, every decision I made was mine alone. Then out of nowhere, a cousin reached out with news. My parents were in financial ruin. The house they had fought so hard to keep was about to be taken from them. The loans they had relied on had caught up with them, and there was nothing left. Their entire world was crumbling, and there was no one left to save them. My younger brother wasn't doing any better. The golden child, the one they had never expected to struggle, was now in the same position they had always assumed I would be in. He had no savings, no financial plan, and no one willing to bail him out. He had gone to relatives asking for money, but after everything my parents had done, sympathy was in short supply. With nowhere else to turn, my parents made one last desperate attempt. They reached out to distant relatives, spinning a new story. They didn't frame themselves as parents who had made financial mistakes. They painted themselves as victims. According to them, I had stolen their retirement money. They told anyone who would listen that I had taken advantage of them, that I had manipulated them into financial ruin, and that they had nothing left because of my greed. That was the final straw. I gathered every piece of proof I had, bank records, loan rejections, legal documents. I sent everything to the relatives they had been trying to manipulate, making it undeniably clear that I had never taken a cent from them. That shut it down immediately. More family members started seeing the truth. The ones who had blindly believed my parents started distancing themselves. Their support system, the people they had relied on to take their side, was slowly shrinking. With their lies exposed, they had no one left to turn to. Then one last message came. My younger brother, using yet another number I didn't recognize. It was clear they weren't going to stop reaching out, even after being cut off. He wasn't angry this time. He wasn't blaming me. He just wanted help. I sent one response. One sentence. You made your choice. Now live with it. Then I blocked the number. That was it. No more loopholes. No more desperate attempts to pull me back in. With no other options, my parents were forced to sell the house. The home they had refused to downsize from, the place they had tried to use as leverage against me, was gone. They moved into a much smaller apartment, their dreams of luxury shattered by their own choices. Meanwhile, I moved to a new city. A fresh start, far from the toxic web they had spent years trying to trap me in. No more looking over my shoulder. No more expecting the next wave of manipulation. Despite everything, I didn't feel guilt, not even a little. If anything, I felt relief. Relief that I had finally stood up for myself. That I had walked away from a cycle of abuse disguised as family loyalty. Family isn't about blood. It's about the people who truly support and respect you. The ones who don't see you as a paycheck, a resource, or a backup plan. Surrounded by friends who had been there for me, who never once tried to take advantage of me, I raised a glass to peace, to independence, to never being manipulated again.